counting all costs as benefits and multiplying by 2. So, I believe that was Andrew Leach's quote but it's sort of a valid criticism that, what are you looking at as costs and what are you looking at as benefits? And so there's one example in economics of the broken windows fallacy, which is that, if you break a window, if damage is done and somebody has to pay to fix the window, well, that's technically still benefiting the economy. That's still stimulating the economy because money is still being spent. And that's kind of a big concern in these economic impact studies is, what kind of stimulating the economy do we want, and what are we calling costs, and what are we calling benefits?
That's true. The broken window fallacy, it's seen as possibly a way of accepting the costs of a certain project, especially an oil spill, because even though it might generate employment, it does have devastating consequences, and other parties are affected, such as a fishery downstream or something who are affected by these type of pollutions. Ngaio, you're in the process of completing your Ph.D, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And how are you getting on with it?
Good. Yeah. It's coming along. I'm actually looking at something a little bit, one kind of particular field of economics called new institutional economics. And, a woman named Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize looking at governing the commons. So her book, and her work more broadly looked at collective action. So people working together and how you get, under what conditions people will work together and cooperate to generate these kind of mutually beneficial outcomes. And a part of that is that she focused on later in her career that she became really interested in was trust. And so how do you create institutions and rules, and how do you get people to work together and create this trust that can help them tackle these problems? Often, natural resource problems, how can you get them to tackle them together?
I haven't come across that. I understand the cooperation and the trust. You might relate it to game theory. But regarding applying it to the environment or interest groups that are part of the environment or the resources, I never really looked at it that way, because some people, or maybe including myself, would assume that some of these resources are owned by the public or by the government and someone has control of them. But in certain circumstances, that could be a bad problem, because you end up maybe polluting that area. I'm not saying you, I mean, some people might end up polluting that area, whereas if it was privately owned, and here's the case for private ownership, is that they might have certain systems, legal systems, or ways of isolating that area so that pollution may not occur. And is this something that you might come across in your research, or have you come across it in certain areas, that private ownership may be better than public ownership of these types of parks and lands and waters?
Right. So you're definitely on the right track in terms of, Hardin's tragedy of commons. And so Hardin kind of in that work, in the tragedy of the commons, about the great turn, the goodwill that you extended to them. And so that's kind of where the starting point is for this work, is that, okay, so under what conditions people live together when they have rights, property rights are shared, a group of people, two groups of people together. In my looking at when they work together and share decisions about natural resources, whether it's parks or fisheries or forests. And so how do you create those rules under which people are willing to work together? And at that point, my research sort of encompasses more than, if you look at it strictly from an economic perspective and a game theory perspective, you have in these experimental games two people that know very little about one another. Their decisions are essentially reduced to calculative decisions about the cost and benefit. But then, outside of an experimental setting where you have groups of people that interact on a regular basis, there are so many more factors that influence that decision to trust. And so this research is drawing broadly on sociology, psychology, organizational behavior, what's known about trust from all those different fields, including economics, but where we recognize that people in a real world setting are making decisions based on, their knowledge of somebody else's expertise, their emotions toward those people, perceived integrity, as well as their own individual propensity to trust based on their kind of lived experience. So it's a huge research topic,
it is, yeah.
But it's very interesting, and I think it'll really contribute quite a bit to the field of new institutional economics, because collective action theory, that sort of stuff, has been a bit neglected ever since Ostrom passed away. In her Nobel Prize lecture, she talked a lot about trust and the future research that she wanted to see in this area. But people have kind of neglected the field in many ways since she passed away, and I've been hearing more about collective action and institutional economics over the past few years, particularly with all the the conflict and sort of acrimony in the political sphere, that I'm hoping that's stimulating more interest in cooperation and collective action.
British Columbia, I suppose, are leading the way in terms of fighting pollution, and they've introduced, as you referred to earlier on, carbon taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And yep. I think you're one of the first ones to introduce carbon taxes, and first country to do so, or even that particular area.
Yeah.
And it's something that Americans are trying to lobby to get Washington to do the same, and using British Columbia and Canada as the benchmark to follow.
Yeah, British Columbia, it was sort of a leader in terms of establishing a carbon tax, and that's been very helpful in terms of studies done on what was the impact on there's always the fear that there will be a negative impact on the economy, but it turns out that British Columbia's economy has been doing just fine ever since the carbon tax was introduced. What's interesting and not many people know is that Alberta has actually had a carbon tax for several years now on industrial emitters. So Alberta doesn't get a ton of credit for its work on the carbon tax. It hasn't gotten quite as much attention, but so what's interesting about that is, Alberta was quite a conservative province. It remains a very conservative province, but you can get support for a carbon tax from both sides of the political spectrum. And when you think about it from a theoretical standpoint, it makes absolute sense. Pricing and economic mechanisms to solve environmental problems. Yeah, there's a lot of common ground for both sides of the political spectrum there. And what's one really interesting thing that I think does get lost a lot in the discussion about pipelines and tankers and emissions and stuff here in Canada is that the right amount of carbon emissions is not necessarily zero. There is a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the climate can deal with and is okay. So we aren't aiming for a completely fossil fuel free society, but we do need to address the current levels of emissions that are beyond what the planet can sort of, and the climate can handle. And that's where these pricing mechanisms come into play, is you want to set the price equal to the marginal cost of emissions, so that sort of the damage per unit of emissions done to the sort of environment broadly, if you will, you want to capture that cost, but you don't necessarily need to drive the amount of emissions to zero.
I can only imagine that once you reach a certain point or a certain level in terms of emissions, what units would emissions be measured in? Is it volume, or is it in terms of? Right. Would it be volume? Would it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like it's a green CO2 equivalent per ton, I think, is usually.
Oh, tons.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can only imagine once you hit a certain threshold that the marginal costs would start to rise at almost an exponential level, and those costs should then be put toward the polluter. The polluter should pay, if that was the ideal case. Because I wouldn't say any incremental cost or any incremental change on pollution levels would stay at a stable rate. Because once you hit certain, like for example, temperatures, if the temperature went from, and I talk about degrees Celsius, if they went from 20 to 21, that's a 1 degree change. That doesn't really have much of an effect outdoors. But if it went from 29 to 30, that 1 degree change is quite hot and it'll burn your grass and you'll end up with drought at those high levels. So if you put it in terms of pollution, once you reach a certain level of tons, and any incremental change above that would be more devastating to the planet or the environment.
Right. And if you want to bring down your emissions faster, you can set the price higher too, right? That's the benefit of a price, is that it can be changed. So it can be sort of increased gradually to allow businesses to adjust, or it could be increased, rapidly to address sort of an urgent problem, and then reduced later once those emissions have come down and new technologies have been, created that aren't as GHG intensive, right? So yeah, that's the added benefit of a price is the flexibility.
Another thing going back to Elinor Ostrom's research, I wonder, does she take into consideration the powerful lobbyist groups, or would they have been as present? Would they have as much political strength at the time when she wrote her paper and received the Nobel Prize, or did she give a full warning as to these groups that could hinder this type of reciprocity and collective collaboration, I suppose, in coming up with a good solution for the environment?
That's a great question. Yeah. I haven't come across references to that kind of issue in her work, in her papers. I think she was mostly focused on, but she does talk about in one of her papers where she has a sort of a conceptual model. She does talk about context, right? The systems context that acts on these people who are making these decisions. And I think that's kind of where this whole range of other things that are acting on these people. So it can be political, it can be historical, legal, it can be lobbying. There's a whole set of sort of external conditions that can put pressure on the people who are collaborating. And that's a very relevant point in the context of relations between First Nations and federal or provincial governments in Canada, is sort of that history of colonialism and distrust that's created as a result of that. So, we have sort of a dark history of residential schools, taking First Nations children away from their families, assimilationist policy, not allowing people to practice their culture. So all those things. So that's another way that the systems context can really affect these collaborative institutions and whether trust can be created. But you're absolutely right. There's a whole set of different things that can act on those institutions.
Now, you do some research with the Resource Economics Group, and I'm wondering how you can take on this role along with working on your PhD if you're doing that full time. In a recent interview I had with Cameron Murray, I think it was episode 96, we talked about him writing his PhD and that he blogged his way through it. So he made made himself accountable to the public, and on a weekly basis or whenever he could on a daily basis, he wrote parts of his PhD, not published it or anything as a blog post, but his research into, before he did final edits or whatever, he posted up there, and he became accountable and then put himself almost under pressure to complete that PhD through this process. And I'm wondering, is it similar regarding your work with the Resource Economics Group, or is this something that you're working with on the side as well as your PhD to concentrate on writing about issues regarding land and food and fisheries?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting idea of blogging to keep yourself accountable, to keep yourself on track. Yeah, so my work with Resource Economics Group, we decided to start that consulting firm. So
Okay.
Myself and another person decided to start that, and we have a couple of people who work on a project basis. There's 5 of us that just sort of work together as projects come up, and it's just a really interesting way to stay involved in kind of current issues, to keep that feeling that your work is that you're accomplishing something, honestly. So I guess it is in a different sense, because the Ph.D., the academic timeline is so long, right? And I've been glad that my research is 2-phased. So the first phase is case studies. So I sort of completed that phase, wrote up the chapter and a couple of papers, and I'm on to the second phase, which is a survey of people who are involved in these collaborations across Canada. But for many people, it's, 4 years and you don't necessarily publish or have kind of tangible outcomes until near the very end. And so consulting is kind of a nice way to keep seeing those outcomes, keep seeing something tangible coming out of your work, and that helps to feel motivated. But I do also really enjoy tackling applied issues, so applied problems, and often our consulting projects are sort of smaller projects, 1 to 3 months long, and they're helping kind of, usually it's a small organization, or typically small to medium-sized organizations, to identify the value or that they're generating, or address a problem that they're facing. And so it's good. It feels good to be helping people in that sense with these kind of short pieces of work.
I've read some of the articles and papers that you wrote on the Resource Economics Group, and they're absolutely fascinating. And they really kind of bring it into not necessarily the mainstream, but that has that added value to allowing people who may not be able to access published research, or may not be able to break down the technical writing that is expected from an academic piece of work. And your resource group allows us to read through some of these papers and articles. And they do have that technical, that high level as well, but it makes good reading. For example, some of them touch on, as I mentioned, on fisheries and on land. And people, like, straight away I looked at the fisheries, and regarding Ireland, we have, as you know, we're surrounded by a lot of water. And again, we have the Irish Sea on the east coast, and on the west coast we have the Atlantic. And given the size of our land, we own a lot more land around us that's a lot bigger than the land mass that we have. But we gave up a lot more back in the 1970s in order to be a member of the EEC at the time, or the EU today, so that we could give up a lot of the waters to the fisheries, which today would be worth a lot of money to GDP, equivalent to somebody who would be rich in, say, oil resources. So this is something that I don't know whether a cost benefit would have been done at the time in the 70s to say, yeah, we should give up some of this in order to be a member. But these papers touch on a lot of different sectors within the natural resource area that I recommend people should take a look at. And I'll put the links on the show notes page for people to be redirected to that website and all those papers that are made available by you and others.
Oh, good. Thanks very much. Well, I'm glad to know that they're getting read. I'll have to update them as well, because I think there's a couple that aren't on there, and I could do a better job of making sure that our peer-reviewed publications are on there too, just for interest. But yeah, I do like to write these op-eds every so often. I've always enjoyed writing for different audiences, but whenever there is sort of a topic, a really important, relevant topic of the day, and, we have some thoughts about it, I do, like to sort of get it out there and get out the economic perspective on it in a way that people will find relatable and will understand, and will kind of get a taste of the issues from an economics perspective. And I was not familiar with the decision that was made by Ireland to kind of give up rights to fishing in the waters. I'm not familiar with the EU context as much, but that sounds like an interesting thing that I should probably be looking into.
And one of the papers that you wrote there, Urban Forestry and the Greening of Canadian Cities, I'm sure that kind of ties in with some of the internship that you did earlier on regarding rooftop food gardening and community gardening. And when I read that straight away, I remembered reading or watching on TED a discussion by Ron Finley, who saw all of these parkways, the green area between sidewalks and parking spots, that were just left idle, and houses that were behind those, or they became responsible for just the maintenance, the cutting of it, or maybe planting a tree there. And what he wanted to do was find a nearby shop that sold organic apples, and he couldn't find any. So what he decided to do was start planting in those areas some apple trees, and he got pulled over by the local council. But after he did his talk on TED, it became quite viral that people started using these parkways to do what was known as guerrilla gardening. And they planted their vegetables, and they grew vegetables, and herbs, and people could go back and trade with one another in the local community. And it solved, say, problems of maybe poverty or improved healthy eating. And I think in Tokyo they're doing the same, and they're known as crack gardens. Wherever there are certain areas in parking lots or housing estates, they use that small bit of green land and they grow their fruits and vegetables. And it's collectively, if you look at these small grass parkways or small areas in parking lots, they add up to a very large landmass that you could feed a population, based on people who are responsible for that small area.
Yeah. And that's been, that idea of urban farming and urban gardening and using those sort of underutilized spaces has been quite big in Vancouver. In part because of the climate too. We have a sort of a mild coastal climate, kind of like Seattle. But yeah, that idea has really taken off in a lot of cities too, sort of across North America. And so that's a great example of, going back to positive externalities, right? That using these spaces in this way, or allowing people to use spaces in this way, can generate a lot of positive externalities that beyond even just the food that is produced. And if you look at it only from a food production perspective, no, it's not as efficient as large scale agriculture, but it is also generating a lot of other positive externalities in terms of, people going outside, in terms of health, people being able to use these spaces, education, people learning about food and healthy eating and where their food comes from and all this kind of stuff. So there are all kinds of interesting organizations operating across Vancouver. There's, Fresh Roots Urban Farm Society, that they do schoolyard gardens. So they take, a portion of schoolyards, they work with the school board and create a farm on a part of a schoolyard that would have been sort of underutilized necessarily, and teach kids about eating and cooking and food and nutrition, all that kind of stuff, and get kids outside. That's, another big problem that I hear about from parents is kids, being inside on their phones. So getting kids outside, doing things with their hands, doing things with each other in person. Then there's another organization here in Vancouver called Shifting Growth that works with property development companies. And so they are paid by these companies to come in and do these sort of small scale urban gardening, urban farming operations on vacant land, that isn't being used. And in Vancouver, there is a tax break for companies that sort of beautify landscape, create sort of nicer spaces on vacant land. So they're paid through those tax breaks and generate these sort of greater positive externalities. So there's lots of really interesting things and interesting models that are being explored here in Vancouver and definitely elsewhere as well. But
that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Ngaio, could I ask you a number of quick-fire questions?
Sure.
Yeah, great. We spoke briefly about the PhD, and you were mentioned about writing and, through the Resource Economics group. But have you got any writing tips or any advice for students of economics who might be doing a master's or their PhD, or even any other economist who wants to sit down and haven't written a research paper in a while, or would like to write a book, and perhaps where they might like to start?
I think one thing that's really important, and this applies across, working on a dissertation, working on a paper, or even writing an op-ed, is that it needs to kind of come from the heart, which is not a thing that you would expect an economist to say, but that you have to feel strongly about this thing that you're writing about. And if you don't, then you need to find a different way to look at it, or a different take on it, or a different set of data or something that will help you to feel that motivation. Because there is so much of being an academic and even, sort of working independently that is about internal motivation. And a lot of people struggle with that internal motivation. So just finding a topic or a piece of a topic, or a technique that can help you to tap into that internal motivation. That idea of, writing a blog about, blogging about your research is a great one, and if that works for you, if that's how you tap into your motivation, then go for it. But there are a lot of different ways, and I think they're different for each person. And also I would say, I guess the other thing I would say is, be very specific in the scope of what you're looking at. So as specific as you can possibly be. So if you're writing an article, like a journal article, or even an op-ed, you have, not a lot of space to convey your thoughts and background on a specific issue. So the more you can narrow down to something very specific, the easier time you're going to have. And that was the same thing with the dissertation too, is that I was constantly trying to narrow down my focus to the sort of narrowest unit I could get to, because otherwise the literature is just so overwhelming and you can get pulled off in so many directions.
And I picked that up from you at the beginning. You were saying you were very passionate about natural resources, or the natural sciences, and when you found economics, you loved it and you were able to bring the two together. And I was there, thinking to myself, that's a very big, that means a lot to be able to complete a piece of research. I wouldn't say piece of research, but it's a big piece of research that you're actually doing. It helps that you're actually very interested and have almost like a personal passion for that type of research, and that does motivate you at a daily basis to keep going and making your way through it. Absolutely.
Yeah, it would be, I still feel very strongly and I'm very interested in this research, and I think that that's super important. And I went back to do a PhD. I didn't go straight through, undergrad, master's, PhD. I took time in between each of those degrees to do some work and then, develop a greater sort of deeper interest in a topic and then go back and study that more. And so, I'm pretty late to the PhD game, but I also think that it gave me time to really think about the topic, to get focused on a specific area, and to bring that kind of attention and motivation to it that is necessary to get you through. And, if somebody can find that going straight through for years from undergrad to master's to doctorate, that's great if they can do it. But I mean, I needed the time to think about it and kind of gain some more real world experience and knowledge, and then bring that into a topic that really interested me.
Ngaio, I'd love if you could recommend a book, or tell us about a book that really influenced you, or something that you might like to share with us that would complement what we were talking about today.
Okay. So, I mean, if I get to go quite nerdy here, Ostrom, any Ostrom piece, I think that Ostrom's Nobel Prize lecture is a good sort of introduction to what she talked about, and it's just available for free online. It's 10 pages long or something like that.
Nice.
And then if that really interests you, then you can move on to her work on governing the commons, which was her book that she wrote. I'm a big fan of her work, and there's also some great videos available of somebody recently made a documentary. They're still in the process of finishing it, but several of these videos are available online called Ostrom's the Movie.
Okay.
About Vincent and Elinor Ostrom, and those are kind of nice for a different audience. Maybe you don't have the attention to sit down and read a whole paper at the end of the day of your workday, but you can watch, one or two of these videos and get a sense of who she was and what she was working on. So, yeah, I mean, right now and for a while, I have been quite into Elinor Ostrom and her work. So, yeah, that's what I would direct people to. I think it deserves even more attention than it's gotten. Despite
receiving the Nobel Prize in economics, do you think Elinor has been giving fair press or fair recognition? Because I'm only saying that because you mentioned Vincent there, and her husband. He was an academic too, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Somebody posted a tweet a couple of days ago. I must actually find it and retweet it. But it was a picture of Vincent and Elinor, and Vincent was the picture was more an academic environment. He had the pen or the penciled paper, the blackboard behind with the mathematical equations or some text. And then the picture of Elinor was very much looking like a homemaker. Right. Or a woman, and the hair was all tied up and in the blouse, and no sense of academia. Now that could be biased, and someone could have intentionally identified these pictures and looked at the two. And I suppose when I say that, really, Marie Curie was the same when she received her Nobel Prize in chemistry, and I think it was physics. And they didn't want to give her the prize; they wanted to give it to the husband. But they collaborated, the two of them, and she was more the driver in the research that she did. And he wouldn't accept it unless she was to receive her equal recognition at the time.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, did she get it? Because you did say that her work has really gone astray, and you and a few other people are the beacons of light and are putting a spotlight now on her work. And it's great. She was only mentioned only once, I think, in a previous podcast episode. And it's great to be able to pick up on her work and give us this type of information that we could go and read her Nobel lecture and also some of the videos and this movie that's being made. It's great to see it in those formats too.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, her story. So she so she wasn't allowed to study economics. She wanted to study, she wanted to do her Ph.D. in economics, and she wasn't allowed as a woman. And so she said, fine, I'll go into political science instead. And she ended up working with Vincent Ostrom. So then they began working together on a lot of things. And he had done some previous super interesting work looking at the commons and water and watersheds outside LA that sort of predated even Hardin's work. So that was interesting in and of itself. And so they were very much equals, and that comes out in a lot of the movies, or in a lot of the sort of film segments for that movie that are available online. But the economists always many economists still sort of deny her as being a real economist, right? They say, well, that was sort of technically political science, and many were reluctant to acknowledge her work at all until she won the Nobel Prize, and then even afterward, they still sort of, well, it's not strictly economics. And I would say that that's not all economists. But there are sort of a vocal subset who still don't really want to acknowledge her work. And this actually came up recently. I saw a presentation where somebody had added, it was a presentation about the commons, and someone had mentioned Vincent Ostrom as in the keywords, but not Elinor Ostrom. And I thought, here we go again, that somebody is trying not to acknowledge her work, trying to erase this woman from history. But in her work, or in the videos that are available online, you'll see that she really wanted Vincent's work recognized as well. That, they considered one another to be equal partners in these sort of intellectual endeavors, and they both brought their own ideas to the table. And so, they both wanted the other one's work to be recognized. And I think it was just very touching. They both seemed like such wonderful people, and also such brilliant people, that I think they're great economist role models, both of them.
If you could step into the DeLorean, Ngaio, and time travel, what year would you like to go back to, and who would you like to meet? Or would you like to kick some ass in terms of those economists who have tried to remove Elinor's work from, I'm sure there was debates at the time to give her the Nobel Prize?
I recently was in a conference with a woman who studied with Elinor and Vincent Ostrom, and she traveled with them when Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize. And if I could time travel, that is where I would want to be, that to go and just hang out with them while she was getting ready to get the Nobel Prize. The stories were wonderful and sweet, and that is, that's the person who I'd really, really like to meet.
Would you have anything in mind to say to her, or what way would you like the conversation to go?
I would just listen. I would just ask a lot of questions, and I would listen and just take it all in.
And that's exactly what I've done today. Asking the questions and listening. And to be honest, it was a great talking to you, Ngaio. I learned a lot from you, and it's great to be able to have another resource for me to look into, and pardon the pun, but your resource economics group. And I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye on it, and can't wait for more op-eds and some other research. And hopefully this will grow, because we need it. We need a group like yourselves, a consulting group, to work with companies and businesses, because it's going to be a benefit for not only the immediate environment which this business works from, but also the expansive environment that we live in. So not only British Columbia, but all of Canada, all of the US, and as far away as Ireland. And we all need to work together. And as you mentioned earlier on, there needs to be some reciprocity and collaboration, and hopefully for the benefit of all resources and the environment too. So I learned a lot from you, and thanks very much. And I'd like to say that you are an economic rock star.
Thanks so much, Frank. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast, and I really appreciate your interest in my work. It is nice. It helps to keep that motivation up, keep morale going for the next year and a half of the Ph.D. Yeah.
And what I'll do is I'll put all the links, books, and resources mentioned in this episode at economicrockstar.com/Ngaio Hotte. That's Ngaio Hotte. So you can check out, go visit our website, and there'll be links that will direct you to Ngaio's own website, Resource Economics Group, and other work that you've published online. Ngaio, thanks very much for spending this time with me.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the chance to be on here.
Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening, as long as they have a device to listen, download, or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.